want to talk about rewilding. I'm going to give a little bit of background first of all about why we need it, and it will complement the last talk from Peter. And I'm going to focus most of my words and images on the Caledonian forest in Scotland and the situation we face there. But along with that, I want to say something else right at the start, which I think is very important. I started this about 30 years ago with no background, no training, no skills, no experience, no resources. And I followed the dream of my heart. And I followed my passion, I followed my inspiration. And because of that, I've been able to achieve what Trees for Life has done so far. We've got lots more ahead of us. But I really want to put that out right at the start, because all of you, or most of you, are at the start of your careers. Some of you are students, some of you are perhaps recent graduates. And you've got your whole lives ahead of you. And the thing I'd really like to emphasize is go for your big dream. Really follow through. What would you like to see in the world when you grow up? And become as old as me? How would you like the world to see? Because it's really in our hands, and I'll return to that later on. I want to start though with this picture of the Earth from space. Many of you have probably seen this before, taken by the Apollo astronauts in 1968, and it's this beautiful blue and white globe. This photograph sits on my wall in my office, and I look at it every day. And about 15, 20 years ago, I became aware for the first time that the most prominent feature in that is the brown earth. It's the deserts of the world. This is actually a picture of a wounded planet, of a planet whose capacity to support life has been radically diminished for at least 2 millennia, probably more than that. But 2,000 years ago, North Africa at the top of the picture was forested, and in there lived the Atlas bear and the Barbary lion and lots of other wildlife, which is all extinct now. And standing here is probably the oldest person in the room. Maybe not, I'm 61, maybe if there's anybody older, I don't know. But I'd like to actually say sincerely an apology to all of you, because my generation is passing on a planet which is more depleted than the one that existed when I was born. And that planet is becoming more depleted every day. Its capacity to support life is diminishing as we speak. This is the need for rewilding in Scotland. This is the landscape we've inherited, I've inherited, all of us have inherited from previous generations. The forest is gone, only the stumps remain, and the wildlife and everything else is gone. And crucially, the ecological processes that would enable that to recover are being actively prevented from taking place. I don't need to say much more about this probably. The photograph is not a Scottish photograph, I hasten to add. I took that in Canada many years ago when I worked in true wilderness. But we can see we've lost most of our large wildlife species. Many of our surviving species like red squirrel, twin flower, wood ants are tiny numbers compared to what they used to be. So much of the natural wealth, the biological diversity has either been removed completely or has been shrunk to a tiny proportion of what we had previously. And this is happening all over the world today. Photograph on the left I took in southern Venezuela in 1992, and burned forest. And we hear a lot about what's happening in places like the Amazon today. Perhaps what we don't recognize is that it's actually just a repeat of what's happened in countries like Britain in the past. And you can see the two landscapes are very similar. There are landscapes that are increasingly dead. And that's why that picture of the planet from space was my starting point. We are destroying and killing large parts of the planet. I am a positive person. We are going to get onto something positive. I think it's important to acknowledge the reality first of all. And some of you perhaps have been up into the Highlands of Scotland. If you look around, scenes like this are ubiquitous. Every glen in the Northwest Highlands, you will find the stumps of our vanished forests in the peat bogs, in what are called peat hags, where the vegetation has been eroded by the elements and the underlying peat has preserved these stumps, sometimes for thousands of years, but sometimes much more recent. And pines, when they die of old age, as most of our are because they're at the end of their lives, they have a high resin content. The wood is preserved for a long time, so these snags, these standing skeletons, can persist for decades or even a century as a reminder of what's been lost. And what's happened is that we've stripped away all the top predators, we've stripped away most of the vegetation, and we've substantially increased the number of herbivores. Red deer numbers have more than doubled in Scotland in the past 30 years. And in Scotland today, we have 5.3 million people, and we have 6 million sheep. So people are outnumbered by sheep. And I sometimes say, as a Scot, we have allowed ourselves to be rather sheepish. We are a nation of sheep, and we've not had control of our own destiny in the past. So it's about reclaiming that. So in this, we've got a totally dysfunctional landscape that's been reduced to a bare minimal level of diversity and, in fact, structural height. If you think about a forest with trees maybe grow 60 feet tall in Scotland, in the Highlands, today our ecosystem is about half an inch in height, because that's all anything can grow without being eaten by the deer. So we've got this landscape that's become a museum piece landscape. It's become static and frozen in time. It's become paralyzed, and it's unable to recover. And in that, it's symptomatic of so many areas of the world today, the deserts that we saw in the picture of the planet from space. And if you look around, you see the impacts of that. Here, the Afric River on the left, not a single tree left from the riparian forest that usually grew there. The trees that held the banks in place, that provided leaf litter, that fed the aquatic invertebrates, that fed the fish. Instead, we've got big blocks of peat getting washed down. And on the right there, you can see the ruins of a croft when people used to live in the land, and those blocks of peat. Nobody can live there now. There's nothing to sustain people or wildlife. What's happened in Scotland, actually, is what's happened to native peoples all over the world. We know about the North American indigenous Indian people. We know about the Aborigines in Australia. Well, in Scotland, the Highlanders were forced off their land too. They didn't get put into reservations. They got put onto boats and went to Nova Scotia. They went to New Zealand and Australia, or they went to the slums of Glasgow. But the same thing, the same consequence was the connection between people and the land was broken. So we've got two contrasting landscapes here, 2 kilometres apart. On the left, Glen Affric. Anybody been to Glen Affric? One person, a couple of people. One of the most intact landscapes in Scotland, one of the few places where you can actually see a more natural looking setting. Mountains in the distance, lochs, and trees of all ages growing there, and trees almost as far as the eye can see. A very rare scene in Scotland today. But just 2 kilometres away, in the same glen, another skeleton, another snag, showing what's been lost there. So just to summarise then, we've lost most of our vegetation, many existing species reduced drastically in numbers, large carnivores and other big mammals gone completely, crucial ecological processes no longer taking place, and human pressures maintaining things at this minimal level through large numbers of herbivores, through muir burn, that's burning for grouse management, through the export of deer and sheep carcasses, which removes nutrients permanently from the ecosystem, and waterlogging of soils that comes about as a result of deforestation. All of those combine to prevent the recovery of the ecosystem. Succession, very important in nature, doesn't take place at all. And at the bare bottom, we've got the peat hags. Nothing there, not even grass will grow in the exposed peat because of browsing pressure. And any of you are gardeners, you know, if you weed your garden at this time of year when nature is really getting going, nature doesn't like bare earth. Nature always covers bare earth with plants. We're preventing that in Scotland today. And the photo on the right, the fence there marks the line where there's grazing on the left and no grazing on the right. And on the left you can see there's some old birches, but everything, the vegetation is suppressed to like half an inch in height. And if you look carefully, you'll see there are little tiny bits of heather there, half an inch high, struggling to flower. The fence keeps deer out from the right, so heather takes over because that's the succession. Grass would give way to heather, and in the heather you get pioneer trees. There's a little birch growing next to one of the fence posts. They bring up nutrients from the soil, deposit them on the surface, making them available for the slower growing species that follow, pine, oak, ash, wych elm, and those sorts of things. And then they reach maturity. They don't regenerate under their own canopy, so you get a light gap, and the whole process happens again. You get a process of succession, of change. Our forests, our landscape in Scotland is a dynamic one. Not today. It's paralysed. And it's paralysed because of the way we mistreat the land. And sometimes the problem is described as too many deer. Well, the deer are not the problem, it's people that are the problem, because people maintain artificially high numbers of deer and sheep on the landscape. The red deer, which you see here, is a woodland animal. Its natural habitat is the forest, but it's had to adapt to a deforested landscape. So you see them on the open hills, but they only grow 2/3 of the size of what they should do and what they used to do in Scotland. If you go to mainland Europe, where woodland still exists, the red deer there are 30% bigger than in Scotland. Go to North America, they're called elk, but it's the same species, Cervus elaphus, much bigger again. So we've got deer forced into live into ever smaller habitat, the woodland, increased numbers, fed artificially in the winter, and they overgraze every tree seedling, as you see in the middle picture here. And nothing survives. And we've got left with what I term the geriatric forest on the right. Old trees reaching the end of their lives and dying without being replaced. It's a sad, painful landscape to go out in, because it's like going to an old people's home, venerable beings at the end of their lives, and nothing replacing them. So that's the state of play today in Scotland. And if you think that was bad, have a look at this. Scotch pine is a last resort for deer to eat. Pine needles are tough and spiky, and I imagine it's like getting acupuncture on their tongues when they eat pine needles. You know? Given a chance, they'll go for rowan. Rowan's much more palatable. It's their tree of choice apart from aspen. And this is a cluster of rowans I've been photographing for over 20 years. And if you look at 2012, the last time I was there, I'll go again next year to this site. If you look at that, they were smaller then than they were 20 years previously when I took the first photograph. A single deer in this landscape will find a rowan and eat it. And you can see there's not a living tree in sight anywhere in the background. That should all be forest. And that is why things are unable to recover by themselves. That's why we humans have to engage in rewilding. If there wasn't such an imbalance here, this landscape would recover by itself. It did 10,000 years ago at the end of the last ice age. There was not a tree in Scotland, and when the ice retreated, the forest spread by itself, wildlife came, and so too did people. And if we weren't mismanaging the land, it would happen again today. So rewilding is actually about assisting natural processes and ecosystems to recover. And I first became aware of this 30 years ago. This is a photograph on the left here taken in 1987, an experimental area fenced off by the then Nature Conservancy Council to keep deer out. And you can see all the little trees there. Nobody planted them. Those are the progeny of the old trees in the background. And there's also birches, but you don't see them because it's winter. Look at the picture on the right. 22 years later, you can see one fence post has been left. The rest of the fence has been taken down because the trees are too big for deer to damage. So it's very simple. If we actually redress the imbalance, nature will take care of itself. So what is rewilding then? For me, there are three main elements, and I think rewilding is often thought of as just one of those, which is the more glamorous part, perhaps, the big carnivores, the apex predators, the wolf, the lynx, and the bear, and there are those things. But actually, that's only one element. To me, there are three key elements, and the first is the restoration of healthy vegetation communities. Not all big mammals need forest, but some do, and we need to get the habitat right before we can bring some things back. Crucially, we need to reinstate ecological processes too. And sometimes people accuse me of saying, why does Trees for Life want to turn the clock back? You know, we've moved on from the days when there was big forest and wildlife. And it's the wrong question. It's not about turning the clock back, it's about starting the clock again, because the clock is stalled. Evolution in Scotland and in so many parts of the world ran into a brick wall and has been halted. And the co-evolution of species and habitats is no longer functional. So it's about getting ecological processes back. Succession I've talked about, nutrient cycling. At the moment we're leaching nutrients from the highlands. The trees that were cut down and burned have lost their nutrients. Every year millions of sheep carcasses are exported off the land and hundreds of thousands of deer are culled. Not hundreds of thousands, thousands of deer are culled, and those carcasses are taken off the land, representing nutrients exported permanently, and nothing's ever put back. I describe it as being like stealing blood from a haemophiliac, because we've got a wounded landscape in Scotland, a depleted landscape, and we're still taking things from it. So re-establish ecological processes, natural disturbance, predator-prey dynamics. They're all missing at the moment. And then the reintroduction of species. So just to go through those very quickly, we begin with restoring healthy habitats. Here's an example from the very early days of Trees for Life. That's what I looked like when I was a bit closer in age to some of you. That's from 1992, that photograph. And that little seedling I'm standing next to was able to grow from the fence that was put up to protect the area 2 years previously. And in those 2 years, 1990, it grew that much. All the needles were 91's growth, and the candles, the buds there, were 92's growth. And on the right, you can see the same tree photographed 6 months ago. That tree was already there. It was getting eaten by deer. Keep the deer out, and the forest recovers. This shows the same area, even more dramatically in my view. This is the heart of the area. It's 50 hectares that we fenced off with the Forestry Commission. And in 1989, before the fence went up, you can see the forest was dying. These standing snags. And you see a few pines in the distance. They were the seed source. Putting the fence up, keeping the deer out, enabled the seeds from those old trees in the background to germinate successfully, not get eaten. And you can see today the standing snags are still there. They persist for decades, but look at all the young trees that have grown up. Again, not planted, nature doing the work herself. So that works, natural regeneration, where you've got a seed source. In most of the highlands, the nearest trees and seed source might be many miles away, so we plant trees too. We started that in 1991. We do not plant in straight lines, we do not plant monocultures, we do not plant in regular spacings. It's actually quite a skill to plant in a way that mimics nature. Groups and clusters, gaps, varied species, picking the right spot, thinking like a pine tree or like a rowan or like an oak. If I was one of those, where would I want to grow? What are the right soil conditions? It's a time-consuming process. Our volunteers who do most of our planting operate at about 10% of the efficiency of a commercial tree planter who's banging Sitka spruce in a straight line. So, top left picture here, the very first planting week we ever did in 1991. That man, Grant McFarlane, I still remember him, one of our first volunteers, holding up a pine seedling, planting it next to the stump of an old pine that had been cut down in the 19th century. There was a forest there not long ago. This photograph taken 11 years later, that's the same stump, and that's the tree he planted. But what's also very important, I don't know if you can see it because of the light, but this area was fenced as well to keep deer out. So not only have the trees grown, but look, the heather, which was suppressed in the top left picture to 1/2 inch in height, has grown up and covered the roots of the pine stump. And then the last picture taken 4 years ago now, the stump is virtually invisible, and you can see how tall the tree is. So that's the start of the recovery of the landscape in the forest. And this is the same area actually, a different view of it. This is the fence. This shows the boundary between the wet desert that Sir Frank Fraser-Darling, the Scottish conservationist in the 1950s, who did the West Highland Survey, he called it the wet desert because of its impoverishment. You can see it outside the fence there. You can see the peat hags, the erosion in the landscape. And inside you see the planted pines, heather flowering there. This is taken in early September. And this plant in the bottom left is bog myrtle, which is an aromatic shrub. And again, highly palatable to deer. And if you look very closely, you can see there's a tiny little bit of bog myrtle outside the fence. We didn't plant that. It came back by itself. And to me, this is the natural garden and the wet desert. And the fence is the boundary. Here's another couple of photographs showing the same thing. It is so obvious and so simple to achieve this. And as a Scot, a native Scot, I'm embarrassed and ashamed that so much of our land is still in this wet desert condition. There's absolutely no reason for it at all. Nature will recover if we give it a chance. So you can see there the heather again, the young trees coming up. In this one on the left, all those birches were regenerated. They weren't planted from the old ones further in the distance. And outside again, you see just the grass and the stumps. So even the peat hags recover. The peat hags, which seem to be in this terminal decline, they're slow to recover, but they do. The one on the left, unprotected. The one on the right, 20 years of fencing there, keeping the deer out. And you can see there's just a little bit of the pine root left, and all the exposed peat, which was around it before, has been revegetated. Nature wants to have abundance on the earth. And when the earth becomes wounded, if I cut my hand, you know, my wounds heal. The same thing happens on the planet. And we see this with volcanic eruptions in places like Mount St. Helens in the States, which erupted in 1980. I visited there 13 years later, and you could see the whole process of forest recovery taking place. We are actively preventing it in Scotland, except in places where we reduce the grazing pressure. So when the vegetation comes back, we then find other life returns of its own accord. So top left is the same picture, the same area I showed a couple of pictures back, that fence with all the heather flowering inside it. Eared willow, we didn't plant it, seeds got blown in by the wind, and a green hair-streaked butterfly comes along to take advantage of the nectar source it provides. Top right, the crested tit, one of the key birds of the Caledonian forest, and that's sitting in that tree that you saw me standing next to 20 years apart, the one with the long hair and the beard and everything. That came and perched in the tree one year when I was photographing it, and it was as though it was saying, "Thank you, you've given me a home again." And the bottom left, very interesting, this is on our land at Dundregan, which is the next valley south from Glen Affric. In Glenmoriston, we own 10,000 acres of land there. It's got some of the best dwarf birch in the country. Dwarf birch is a montane scrub species. It grows at the tree line up the mountains, you know, 500 meters up or so. And there's virtually none of that left in Britain today, because those plants at the scrub line, they typically grow about waist height. Dwarf birch will grow a meter high, which is dinner table height for deer. And because of the steepness of the slope, the elevation, and so forth, the things grow very slowly, so they're very vulnerable to overgrazing. So there's virtually none of that habitat left. At Dundregan, we found a lot of dwarf birch. We've done some experimental work to protect it from grazing by fencing it off, and the dwarf birch is growing, and we've found 2 species of sawfly now that are endemic to, they only feed on, or obligate feeders on dwarf birch, nothing else. No previous records in Britain. So by allowing that to grow, we've created a habitat for these rare species. So we've got habitat recovery, we've got some ecological relationships rebuilding, and the next step then is the return of the missing species. In Britain, unfortunately, being an island, we cannot experience the same thing that's happening elsewhere in Europe, which is that wildlife is spreading again. For 2 reasons. One is, after the collapse of communism, the big barrier fence that separated East from West Germany was brought down, and wolves began spreading west. Last year, I don't know if you know it, but wolves were sighted in Holland for the first time. In Holland, densely populated country, you know, people everywhere, very little wild land, but they've got wolves back there. They would have reached Britain by now if we weren't an island. So if we want to get those species back, we've got to bring them back. We've got to make a conscious choice, and we've got to physically transport them here. We've got to do a reintroduction. So in Scotland, we've had several reintroductions over the past few decades, mainly of birds of prey. The sea eagle, the red kite, and ospreys have returned by themselves. So those are success stories. We've also had the beaver trial running there for 5 years. It finished last year, although the beavers are still there at Knapdale. And there's now a beaver trial not far from here, relatively not far from here, in Devon, officially approved by the government too. And we've got a big population of beavers living in the Tay catchment in Scotland. Nobody quite admits to how they got there, but there's an estimated 250 of them. And it's a much better example of the return of beavers than the official trial, which was subject to all sorts of compromises, and they didn't pick a good site for it. So we've got beavers back. There's also wild boar back, not far from here. They got loose after the big storm of '87. Forest of Dean, there's some. There's also some in Scotland that are on the loose now. And again, it's questionable how they got free. Some of them we know came from a place called Glendessery at the west end of Loch Arkaig in the Highlands. And there's an estate there, the Glendessery estate, which is a typical sporting estate. They advertise for people to come and shoot deer, and they now advertise for people to come and shoot wild boar. So whether they escaped or they were clandestinely released, we don't know, but they're spread and they're out there in the landscape. So we've actually got de facto populations in Scotland of 2 of our missing species. And this year, the Scottish Government is going to make a decision about the future of beavers in Scotland after the end of the trial. So there's a lot of us pushing hard to make sure we get the right decision at the moment. So that's what I want to end with then. My vision is a big vision. It's the one in which the 21st century is remembered in future millennia as the century of restoring the earth, the century of rewilding. where people from all nations, all cultures, all backgrounds came together for the first shared task of all humanity. We've never had a task that unites everybody before. We've never had a goal that brings together everybody. Surely it has to be helping to heal our wounded world.